I absolutely love the Champions League. I think you guys have heard this from me. You heard it in the last video, but I just want to re-emphasize again how much I love the Champions League. And this week was no different. Let's not forget the Europa League. I'm going to give the Europa League some love because this week I had so many takeaways from both competitions this week, including is Vinicius Jr.'s impact in this Real Madrid team so grand that do they even really need Kylian Mbappe? Are you a bit too harsh on footballers nowadays? Are you a bit too harsh on footballers nowadays in the social media climate that we live in? And last but not least, is Xabi Alonso really a manager that can go right to the very top? Let's discuss that. Let's start off in Bavaria. And I want to start off with the biggest team in all of European football, Real Madrid. And I want to start off in particular with one player, Vinicius Jr. We all saw what he did in Germany, right? And this is not a new thing with Vinicius Jr. And that's why I wanted to talk about him today. This guy, we genuinely need to talk about this guy as being maybe the best player in the world. Forget about Erling Haaland and Kylian Mbappe and is Vinicius in the tier below that? I think this guy's right there up with them. I think you look at the performances he puts in for Real Madrid week in, week out in La Liga, but most importantly of all, the Champions League. This is 3 years in a row now. 3 seasons in a row now that Vinicius Jr. has been performing at the highest level for Real Madrid. He did it in the final against Liverpool. He did it in the 2 legs against Man City. He did it in the 2 legs against Man City last season. He did it in the 2 legs against Man City this season. This guy is performing every single time Real Madrid need him. And when Karim Benzema was in and around the squad and he was kind of coming to the end, it always felt like the next player to take it from him was going to be Vinicius Jr. Forget about the headlines, forget about everything you read in the papers, that this is Jude Bellingham's team. Jude Bellingham's the best player in this team. This team needs Jude Bellingham. This team doesn't need Jude Bellingham. This team needs Vinicius Jr. And it got me thinking, you look at the performance he put in Bavaria. Of course, Toni Kroos having a huge part to play in Real Madrid's draw against Bayern Munich. But you look at somebody like Kylian Mbappe, who's coming into the squad next season, and we all see Kylian Mbappe as this left winger, right? He likes to occupy that left-hand space and come inside. He's not your typical number 9. He played that number 9 role for PSG this week, and he kind of looked out of sorts. And I feel like if Kylian Mbappe comes into this team, where exactly is he going to play? If you put him at the number 9 position, I don't think he's going to be as efficient as you'd want him to be. I feel like Vinicius Jr. and him might get into each other's way, but at the same time, you never know, they might help each other. They might actually elevate each other's game. You look at the way Vinicius and Rodrigo play with one another. Rodrigo, who's actually a typical left winger, he said it himself, he prefers to play on the left-hand side, yet Vinicius and Rodrigo have one of the most deadly partnerships in all of Europe. So I'm not saying that Vinicius's partnership with Kylian Mbappe cannot work. It probably can, maybe in a 2-man formation, maybe not in a front 3. But I feel like sometimes you don't want all the big players on the same team. Obviously, Real Madrid is synonymous with the Galacticos, and that's what they want. They want the big names, they want the big brand, they want the best players in the world because they are the biggest team on the planet. But I feel like you look at the way Vinicius Jr. plays, he's got the number 7. For me, he's the franchise player. He is the franchise player. He is the main man. And Modric is leaving in the summer, which probably means Mbappe is going to come in and take in that number 10 shirt. But I don't know. There's just something about it. I look at the way Vinicius plays in this team. I look at the way he conducts himself with this new generation of Real Madrid players coming into the squad, bleeding into the squad. I don't think Kylian Mbappe can just come in and become the main guy. I just don't see it. I'm not sure if there's going to be an ego. I don't know if there's going to be that sort of thing going on. I doubt it. I hope not. I think Carlo Ancelotti can keep that in check. But obviously, I hope that happens because I'm a Barcelona fan. I hope everything that Real Madrid does crumbles. But from a footballing landscape, Vinicius Jr. is an absolute diamond of a footballer. I mean, every time I watch this guy, he's one of the few players on the planet who actually gets me up off my seat. He's one of the last few players on the planet who I genuinely enjoy watching. Week in, week out, he does something different. Unlike many players nowadays, he is unpredictable, completely dynamite. But I don't know. I look at the way Kylian Mbappe plays. It's pretty similar, very similar kind of footballer. I don't know if they can play with each other. But Kylian Mbappe is inevitably going to join Real Madrid, and I think at the end of the day, they have to work out how that's going to work. Maybe I might talk about that and try and think about it and maybe make a video on that in the future. Let me know down in the comments if that's something you guys would like to see, how Vinicius and Kylian Mbappe might play alongside one another. But it's something that I was thinking about as I was watching the game. I look at the positions Vinicius takes up, and I just feel like they're gonna get into each other's way. Surely they're gonna get into each other's way, but maybe not. Maybe Ancelotti has something. Maybe he has a plan that I'm not seeing. I'm just a mere casual fan, but I just look at the way Vinicius plays football, and I look at the way Kylian Mbappe plays football, the spaces they both operate in, the way they both like to play the game, the way their patterns of play. I don't see how they can both play in the same team. And that's a dilemma that Real Madrid are probably happy to have, because these are two of the best players on the planet. Speaking of the best players on the planet, I also wanted to talk about something that I noticed over the past week. Obviously, most of you that probably watch this video, you guys are on Twitter. From when I was on Twitter this past week, you see your typical reactionary, procedure from football fans all over Twitter. You see the way in which they criticize players and then do a complete U-turn the minute that player shows any glimpse of actually being a professional footballer. And I felt like you look at the way in which this Champions League semi-final panned out, the way in which Jadon Sancho showed his level, Kim Min-jae had an absolute horror show, or even the way someone like Jude Bellingham, who's been great all season, wasn't really up to it. People like Jamal Musiala really showed their level. Florian Wirtz for Leverkusen showed his level. Granit Xhaka as well. And I was having this conversation with one of my mates just a few weeks ago about a few players playing at Chelsea, Mykhailo Mudryk, and I think it was Callum Hudson-Odoi, who had recently left Chelsea as well. And the discussion was essentially about how bad some of these players were. Now, of course, this is something that as football fans, we're very, very used to doing, ridiculing and criticizing footballers for any small mistake that they make. And I feel like sometimes we forget how elite these footballers are. I mean, look at Kim Min-jae, for example. This kid, can't even call him a kid, he's in his prime. This guy was at Napoli last season and was the best center back across all of Europe. And now he's come to Bayern Munich this season and he looks a shadow of himself. And I don't think that's a mere chance. I don't think Kim Min-jae is automatically now just a rubbish defender. I don't think Kim Min-jae is now just a bad player overnight. I feel like it got me thinking, because we also spoke about Mudryk, we spoke about Anthony Elanga and Callum Hudson-Odoi, and how footballers need an environment around them. This was fortified by Jadon Sancho's performance against PSG. He was the best player on the night. I think he completed 11 take-ons, the most that any player has ever completed since, I think, Lionel Messi since 2008 in the Champions League at least. And you look at the way that he played. We've never seen that. We've never seen that Jadon Sancho at Manchester United. In his entire, I think he's been there, 3 years now? We have never seen Jadon Sancho ever play like that. And it's not automatically, now that Jadon Sancho is in Germany, he's a good footballer. That's not how it works. That's not how football works. You need an environment around you. You need a manager who trusts you. You need players who fit with what you want to do. You look at the way that Jadon Sancho was played at Manchester United, you could tell that the way he thought about football was completely different to how anybody else around him did. Even the attitude of the player also comes into question. The player that I just talked about in the previous segment, Vinicius Jr., fast forward, rewind, I'd say 5-6 years ago, Vinicius Jr. was completely written off. Everybody was ridiculing him. Karim Benzema was even saying don't pass to him. I don't know whether that was true or not, but there were jokes like that saying don't pass to him, he's playing against us. Vinicius Jr., who is now arguably top 3 players in the world. I feel like people, especially people online, social media, I'm a victim to it. I've done it myself. Ridiculed players who are elite footballers, professional footballers. You can't be a professional footballer and not be good at football. But football's so volatile. Things change so quickly. Games are defined by such fine margins that I don't think it's fair to criticize footballers. Obviously, I'm from a generation in which Messi and Ronaldo had their fun with football, right? Week in, week out, year in, year out, these guys were the 2 best players on the planet, barring a few years. And when you have that expectation of what footballers are supposed to be, anything below that is seen as an absolute car crash. Look at the way Jude Bellingham played against Bayern Munich. He had an off game on the night. He wasn't really impactful for Real Madrid, but that's not the end of the world. This kid is 20 years old, playing for Real Madrid in a Champions League semi-final. I believe that's his first Champions League semi-final in his career. His first Champions League semi-final in his career, playing for the biggest team on the planet against Bayern Munich, a team he's never beaten in his career. It's not the end of the world if he doesn't put in a 10 out of 10 performance. He's not an all-time player. This kid is still developing. He's still learning his craft. Somebody like Phil Foden, we call him, oh, he cannot play without Kevin De Bruyne. Kevin De Bruyne needs to hold his hand. Phil Foden is 23, 24. He's still a kid in footballing terms. He's just getting to his prime. I feel like the mystique of football has kind of disappeared. Now we have so much access to football, whether it's the football in our country or it's the football in other leagues or different competitions. We have so much access to football that now we can analyze every single thing that footballers do. There's databases that analyze statistics and bring up XG, and fine, these statistics are fine, but what about just enjoying football? What about understanding that a player can be flawed? A player can have 5 games that are really good and then 10 games that are absolutely awful. It doesn't mean that that player is an absolutely abhorrent footballer. Any of you who actually play football know that sometimes your performance is out of your control. You can put in as much effort as you want, but sometimes the game just passes you by. It passes you by because there's 22 players on the field. You can't have an impact on the game every single week, and we can't hold some players to a certain standard of others just because those other players have been elite for years. Messi and Ronaldo, for example. I feel like it's completely unfair and unjust. The manager has an impact to play. The players around that player has an impact to play. Moving to a new country and learning a new language, learning a new culture, and adapting to a new team, that's a completely different thing you need to talk about. So I feel like I noticed that I was doing it myself, and I've kind of softened the punches recently, and I kind of give players a bit of leeway. I give them a bit of benefit of the doubt, because these footballers, they are elite. Like, if any of you have ever had the opportunity to play with a professional footballer, you will see not even a professional, a semi-pro footballer. The difference between them and a casual footballer is night and day. So I feel like for us to be criticizing these professionals just because the margins at the highest level, they're so thin. Look at the Real Madrid Bayern Munich game. That is one of the most elite games of football I've seen in a long time. Margin. Look at the first goal. If Kim Min-jae doesn't commit to that, Vinicius Jr. doesn't score that. Only an elite player does something like that. Only an elite player like Toni Kroos picks out that pass. Only an elite player like Jamal Musiala wins that penalty. Only an elite player like Leroy Sané gets into that position to score that goal. These players are not bad players. Some of them might just be going through a rough patch. Some of them might just be out of form. Some of them might just not be in the right mental state. Some of them might just not be in the right club. But then some of them might just be actually bad footballers. I know I just talked about it for a long time and how we shouldn't criticize, but some of them are just not good footballers. How they got there, I don't know. How they became professional footballers, we need to ask that question. But for a majority of them, you don't always get the rub of the green. And I think us football fans, social media in particular, we need to give some of these players a leeway, because not every single player is going to be perfection. Even the greats that we talk about all the time, your Zlatans, your Messis, your Ronaldos, your Bales, your Neymars, your Suarez's, etc., they had bad games. But there was a mystique around them because you didn't always see those bad games. You only saw the highlights. You only saw the peak. But now, if a player puts in a bad performance, there's a 5 to 10 minute fail compilation posted on Twitter 10 minutes after the game. 10 minutes after the game, I saw a 16-year-old Lamine Yamal fail compilation when he went to the Parc des Princes in the quarterfinal. A 16-year-old. We're making a fail compilation on 16-year-olds now. It's disgraceful. It's disgraceful. It's frankly, it's very disappointing. And I think we need to give footballers a little bit of leeway. We need to give them a little bit of leeway because they're playing at the highest level and they're entertaining us. So we need to appreciate what they're doing, because some of them are completely incredible footballers, and criticizing them is only going to hurt them, not bring them up. So I think we need to stamp that out of football and stamp it out quick. Now, this last portion of the video is essentially just going to be like a brief tactical analysis of some things that I noticed from Xabi Alonso's side against Roma. Of course, they came out 2-0 victors, Florian Wirtz and Robert Andrich with the 2 goals for Leverkusen. But there were some things that I noticed, and I wanted to just talk to you guys about it. I've got my laptop up here, and the first thing that I wanted to really talk about was Xabi Alonso has been described as this manager who is a Pep disciple. Obviously, being managed by Pep, the initial reaction by the media and by many people alike is to call him a Pep disciple. But I look at the way he set up against Roma and the way he set up against Daniel De Rossi's side, and I feel like you can see elements of Jose Mourinho, you can see elements of Carlo Ancelotti, you can see elements of Rafa Benitez in that pragmatism. I feel like in a league setup, Pep Guardiola is the best manager we've probably ever seen. But in a cup competition, your Rafa Benitez's, your Jose Mourinho's, your Carlo Ancelotti's, these managers have shown that their setups might be better for a one-time knockout competition. And that was shown on display because Xabi Alonso set his team up. Typically, they set up in a 3-4-3. But in this game, it was like they were set up in a 3-4-3, but also a 3-5-2. Jeremy Frimpong was playing as a right winger of sorts, but also playing as a right wing back, with Florian Wirtz and Adli being the two strikers, but also being false nines. And I don't think this was out of the ordinary. I don't think this was just a rotation from Xabi Alonso, because he had both Schick and Boniface on the bench, and he didn't play any of them for the full 90 minutes. And I feel like this was definitely done to give his team an advantage, because his two false nines created so much confusion for Roma throughout the game. You look at the way in which they dropped and created overloads for people like Grimaldo, for people like Andrić, for people like Granit Xhaka. And Roma themselves, they set up in a 3-5-2 with Romelu Lukaku up top. Sorry, they set up in a 4-4-2. And the way they set up allowed Leverkusen all the superiority in defense, because they had three people back: Tas, Tapsoba, and I think it was Hincapié, who was the third center back. And typically that's always going to give Leverkusen the advantage in the build-up phase. But also in the midfield, you look in the way in which they were set up. Roma had a 4-4-2, but because Leverkusen have 5 men in the midfield, they're always going to have that overload no matter where you go. Whether it's in a tight space or it's across the field, they stretch the play. They had relative width, but at the same time, they were able to drag players out of position. Granit Xhaka was moving all over the field. Him and Andrić were so close to each other throughout the game. Grimaldo and Frimpong were essentially doing whatever they wanted in this team, because Granit Xhaka was the insurance policy for Grimaldo. He was allowed to bomb forward whenever he saw fit. The Ancelotti we see in this team, Jeremy Frimpong, is not a typical right winger. He's not even your typical right wing back. I don't even know what this guy is. He plays wherever he wants, and he does it to such a high level. He was moving positions depending on the situation. Adli and Wirtz, as I said before, always popping into different spaces, always creating confusion, always dragging center backs out of position, which then allowed people to move ahead of them and get into the spaces. Stanisic, who was a center back, or he was a right wing back in this game, he was making runs over and over and over and over again. And it reinforced to me, even though I've watched Leverkusen play in the Bundesliga, this team is not a possession crazy team. There are games in which they don't mind giving the ball away to the opposition. Of course, we saw it against Bayern Munich, we saw it against Dortmund, we saw it a few weeks ago against Stuttgart. They don't mind giving the ball away and playing on transitions, because when you have people like Grimaldo, Wirtz, and Adli, you can play like that. You invite the pressure, but then create space when you do get the ball, because then once you're able to move the ball fast enough, you have so much space to move into. You have so much area to play. And I think it works well in a European landscape, because in Europe, you're not always going to have the rub of the green. You're not always going to have control, especially away from home. And I think he recognized that. The way in which they played last year against Jose Mourinho's Roma, obviously a different manager, but the same team. And I think Xabi Alonso learned from that. We saw it in his press match interview. He said that they learned from last year's failings. That's a paraphrase. They learned from last year's failings, and you saw that because they set up to stifle Roma's strengths and bring out their weaknesses. They played with a relative width, which is essentially just width depending on where your opposition is. Rather than just stretching out the entire team, they actually played with a width dependent on where Roma's players were, which allowed them to create overloads wherever they were on the field, because they had more midfielders than Roma. Paulo Dybala doesn't track back, so they were able to essentially run the four-man midfield however they wanted to. They had overloads on the ball at many instances, and most players had the freedom to go wherever they saw the space. Even though Leverkusen were the better side, and it was a topsy-turvy game, Roma had their chances, and I feel like that's the most important thing about it. European competition is so unpredictable. We saw with Pep Guardiola a few years ago. You cannot control what happens in Europe, so sometimes you have to give your team the best opportunity to win games, and it felt like that's what he did. I felt like they were so strong, as all German teams are. We see it with Dortmund, we see it with Bayern Munich. So strong, so physical. They will run and run and run, and they will always make every game a battle. They had a fair share of the dark arts with the time wasting and, the kicking the ball out of play and all sorts, but they also know how to move the ball around. I felt like all of these things that I've talked about briefly now, is all encapsulated by their first and second goals, the 2 goals on the night, right? And you look at the first goal from Bayer Leverkusen, and we look at it here, right? We watch the way in which they play the ball. The ball is played up here. You want to stop it right here, right? And Grimaldo runs into that space. Adli should never be winning that header, but the determination in this Leverkusen team is that they never give up. And Grimaldo makes that run into that space. And by making that run, he's in a very well-equipped position to apply pressure to Karsdorp, who then makes the inevitable mistake, which leads to the first goal. Obviously, you know what happens from there. But that goal doesn't even happen unless Grimaldo makes that pressure. It doesn't even happen unless Grimaldo actually takes action to move forward and say, you know what, he might not get this ball. Adli should never be winning that header. Against Chris Smalling, he should never, that's not an aero deal that should even exist. Yet, he does make it a thing, and Grimaldo reaps the benefits, and Florian Wirtz makes it 1-0. Fast forward to the second goal, and this second goal is just, I was selling it to some of my friends, and they were like, "What's this guy talking about?" But this second goal is this is elite. This is just elite. I'm not even gonna talk much. Let me just show you. And it starts from the defenders. Look at the way in which they play. They receive the ball, they pop it about, and as I said before, Andrić and Xhaka, they're so close to each other, constantly moving. But then Xhaka receives the ball in such a nice position. But even before we get to that, before we even get to Xhaka receiving the ball in that space, how is that space even created? If you look closely and you watch Florian Wirtz's movement, and this is what I was talking about, moving around, right? Dragging players out of position. Roma play with a 4-4-2. And when you're playing a 4-4-2 against a 3-5-2, you're finished. Especially if you have 2 false nines, you are completely finished because your wing backs are pinned back. Your wingers aren't even going to be able to support because you are outnumbered on the wide areas. Your striker is outnumbered completely. Your center backs are completely outnumbered depending on how you're pressing, because both Wirtz and Adli were pressing the entire game. But that's not even the fact of this goal. This goal here, look at Florian Wirtz's position. He's picking up a position where he's on the blind side of Pellegrini, right? The 4-4-2 I talked about, you have your right midfielder and your center midfielder pressing. But as I said before, Leverkusen have the numerical overload. Xhaka and Andrić close to each other as always. Look at Florian Wirtz's movement. He moves on the blind side of Pellegrini. He notices the space. Once Grimaldo leaves that space, he notices the space. He runs into the space. Grimaldo and Wirtz, they see each other. They understand each other. Wirtz moves up to that left-hand space, that left wing position that Grimaldo typically occupies. Grimaldo comes inside. And the minute Granit Xhaka recognizes that, Adli, he goes, and Grimaldo has that space because Chris Smalling has to follow. He has to follow. And that's the thing. At this elite level of football, goals don't just happen. Goals happen from mistakes. Little tiny mistakes that lead to goals. Adli goes. The minute he goes, that space completely opens for Grimaldo. Mancini is not alive to it. And to be honest, I can't even blame him because Chris Smalling has been taken completely out of where he should be. He should not be on that side. He should never be on that channel. He completely leaves all the space open through the center and Grimaldo's gone. Grimaldo drives into that space, and once Grimaldo gets there, we just see elite football from just elite players playing the ball through. Frimpong controls it down, and then our lovely strike from Andrić. But on the face value, it's like, oh wow, it's just an incredible goal from Andrić, and that's just elite footballers being elite footballers. But no, this Xabi Alonso team, they are a good team. They are in sync, and I feel like he needs to stay at this team. He needs to stay at this team, and he needs to keep on working because I love Florian Wirtz. I'm a Florian Wirtz stan. I'll tell you guys now, one of my favorite players on the planet. And the way in which he's used in this team, the way in which all the players in this team are used, there's a structure, but there's also a relationism, as Ancelotti describes it, and there's an in sync. They're all in sync. So I think these players, they need to stay together. Alonso needs to keep this team together and needs to keep on building, because what I saw against Roma, now granted Roma are not the best team in the world, but this also is not the best players in the world. This Leverkusen team does not have the best players in the world. Yet look at the way they're playing. And that's what I always said. I said in the previous segment, the manager has such an impact on the players. An average player can look incredible under one manager and average under another. But I feel like Xabi Alonso's versatility to change his tactics and not be stubborn and actually learn from his mistakes, which he learned from in the semifinal last year against Roma, I think that's something that's going to take him right to the very top. But of course, that is all for today. Thank you guys so much for tuning into another episode of Football Fanatic. And I'm actually very content with everything I've discussed today. I think there's a lot to process. So let me know down in the comments what you guys thought about everything. Do you think that Kylian Mbappe and Vinicius Jr. can play together? I genuinely think they can. When you have two players that are that good, they probably can work it out. Do you think they were a bit too harsh on footballers in today's climate? And last but not least, do you think Xabi Alonso's team are going to go right to the very top? Do you think this team, not even this team, this manager is capable of coaching the best teams across Europe? Let me know that and a whole lot more. But thank you guys so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.